I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we think of each other. In today's episode, we're looking at the idea of the politician as one of us. And my guest is Professor Peter Allen from the University of Bath.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
Here's a conundrum for us to think about today. When people are asked what they don't like about politicians, they often say that they seem to come from a different world, that they don't share or understand the experience of ordinary people, that they don't speak like us, and especially for working class voters, that they somehow seem to look down on the people they're asking to vote for them. Remember this person from an earlier episode?
They're very clever at saying things that sound right, but if you dig into it, you realise that actually it's not. They've not said quite what you thought they did. I think they're very good at using words to manipulate people and manipulate how people see things.
And she's right. A lot of politicians do sound as if they're using words against us rather than to communicate with us.
Necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the plea of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves. Those are the words of William Pitt the Younger, which is why I've got his bust next to me.
It's tempting to think that politicians like that were grown in a laboratory, bred to calculate rather than to feel. But here's the odd thing. This is a conundrum. It's often precisely the politicians who do come from the same background as working class voters who are dismissed by those voters for being too commonplace, perhaps not smart enough, maybe not quite rehearsed enough in their speech to be worthy of respect. And ironically, it's a public school educated multi-millionaires like Nigel Farage, for example, who are often regarded as one of us. So what is this one of us quality, I wonder? Is it a politician's ability to hang out in pubs without seeming conspicuously out of place, or talk about football matches as if they've ever actually watched one, or make speeches that sound like your Uncle Albert sounding off after one brandy too many after his Christmas dinner? In other words, are we looking for some kind of performance of the ordinary, some sort of posture of every man and every woman? Or is there something going on here that speaks more to the nature of political representation? Could it be that those who are deemed to be one of us seem not to be telling us what to think, but simply articulating what we do think already, sometimes giving voice to opinions that most people keep quiet about because they think they're either offensive or unsubstantiated, or both? So perhaps voters don't really want representatives who are just like them, but ones who project what they would like to be like. Being one of us in this sense means embodying the qualities that constitute our fantasy selves, the people we would imagine ourselves being if we were politicians, the people who we would be if we were unfiltered. Meanwhile, the few remaining politicians who do come from typical working class backgrounds tend to be criticised for failing to be working class enough, for having been co-opted by the culture of the establishment. Recall the extraordinary fuss made when John Prescott, the Deputy Prime Minister, after all, was photographed playing a game of croquet, as if somehow a person from his background shouldn't ever be seen doing that. Or when Angela Rayner had the audacity to set up a trust fund for her disabled son. What sort of working class person does that? It's as if the only role for a political representative from a poorer or more disadvantaged background is to wear a cloth cap and be seen eating fish and chips out of yesterday's newspaper, The Sun, of course. So when Keir Starmer speaks frequently of his pride in his father's work as a skilled toolmaker and his family's experience of often finding it hard to make ends meet as he was growing up, this is often regarded as a subject for ridicule, as if the more he speaks about his origins, the greater his sin in moving beyond them appears to be. Of course, the reality is that the us that voters want politicians to be one of is not a homogeneous entity. It's demographically, economically, and culturally pluralistic. It's an us of many hues. The one common factor, though, is a very simple one. It's that we're all human beings. And perhaps that would be as good a starting point as any for assuming the role of being one of us. Politicians who have common human experiences, rather than seeming to come from a world of ideological abstraction and statistical aggregation. Perhaps they're the ones who are the best candidates to be one of us. Politicians who speak and joke and listen like human beings, rather than speechifying at human beings. Perhaps they're the ones who should be one of us. Politicians whose humanity transcends social categories, just as we all do at our best. Perhaps they're the ones who should be one of us.
We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone.
But I want to know more about why voters seem to want politicians who seem to be like them. So my guest today is Professor Peter Allen, who is Professor of Politics at the University of Bath, and whose work, The Political Class, Why It Matters Who Our Politicians Are, offers a tremendously thoughtful insight to the subject we're discussing today. Peter Allen, it's wonderful to have you here today. And you wrote what I think is one of the best books about politicians, your book, The Political Class. And you say the following at the very beginning of your book, and I'm quoting here: "The view I hold is simple. In terms of what can and should be changed about British politics right now, the question of composition needs to be top of the agenda. I think that dealing with this issue may be the most single influential thing we could do to break the cycle of anti-political thinking we appear to be stuck in and rejuvenate public interest and investment in the political process." So my question to you, Peter, is why you think this should be top of the agenda and would be the most influential thing we could do, as opposed to, for example, recruiting politicians who are very good at listening, regardless of their background, or who are the wisest people in the land, or who are prepared to adhere to democratic norms. Why is it that representativeness of composition trumps these other objectives?
I wrote that a long time ago, and actually, my view on it has changed somewhat. But I still believe that composition matters a lot. I think one thing I would say is that I think the last few years since I wrote that, so I probably wrote some of that, the best part of 10 years ago. I think events have challenged my view in that I think that perhaps the institutions and the sort of broader culture is maybe more robust to changes in composition than I thought it would be. Maybe that's something we can discuss separately.
Yes.
The reason that I thought that composition mattered more than, like you say, having the wisest people or people who are really good listeners is because I think those things often run downstream of who somebody is in terms of their characteristics. So we know, for example, people from certain backgrounds are simply more likely to take seriously other people who share their backgrounds, whatever those backgrounds may be. And politics isn't just about wisdom, it's about the formulation of problems, and it's about framing in the first instance what we think a problem is and prioritizing, so deciding whether we think problem A is more important than problem B, and so on and so forth. And I think that you won't have a full picture of the kinds of problems that might exist in a society, or indeed the kinds of solutions that might solve those problems, if you don't have a range of people from all across that society. So to give you an example, we've had instances globally, but I'll talk about the UK, where, for example, policies have been implemented around changes to the benefits system, for example, that have then suddenly had these unintended consequences. So I'm thinking of the introduction of universal credit, which was done in such a way that people receiving it had to wait an incredibly long time for the first benefit payment. And partly that was because at no point in the development of the policy had anyone asked someone who was likely to be a recipient of it how they dealt with their finances on a week-to-week basis. So it sort of wasn't known that this would cause this problem because people hadn't really thought about finances in the way that they, as sort of middle-class professional civil servants and politicians, were used to. So that would be my sort of starting point with that, is that you can't just deal with politics as if it's solving a problem, because it's not just about solving the problem, it's also about defining that problem in the first place.
Yeah, that's very well put, and incredibly encouraging to hear a fellow academic who not only is prepared to change his mind, but prepared to admit that he's changed his mind at some extent. So this is a good start to the conversation. Well, let's focus upon one aspect of social diversity, which is class. And I think it's the one that you have written about most, and probably the one that is most important in many respects. And you show in your book how the contemporary political class is overwhelmingly not working class. How, in practical terms, would one go about trying to change that?
Yes, like you say, the contemporary sort of political class, or the average contemporary politician, is firmly middle class across all of the parties. It's become something that is like the other professions. Part of the answer to that is to look at why we've got to the situation that we are in, where so few politicians have a working class background. A big part of that is the way that the institutions that used to link civil society to politics have declined. Now, in the case of the working class, I'm thinking primarily of trade unions. So trade unions used to provide a solid route for someone who had a traditional working class job, manual labor, for example, in the 20th century. That was a trade union was a way for them to move from being a manual laborer to gain education, often through the trade union, political education, and then enter politics through the left-wing Labour Party. So actually, when we talk about the decline of the working class in Parliament, what we're actually talking about is a change in the way that the Labour Party has filled its parliamentary benches. So it still takes trade union candidates, clearly, and people with relationships to trade unions, but the nature of the kind of working class Labour that we're thinking of when we think of the working class has changed. So obviously, we had a big decline in those manual labour jobs towards the end of the 20th century. And the jobs that have come to replace them, in particular in the sort of low wage service sector, are not unionized in the same way. So there is not that political connection, for example, from being a call centre worker in South Wales now in the towns that previously you would have been a miner who had a strong union connection and so on. So if I was in the Labour Party and I was minded to, or indeed in any party, but particularly the Labour Party, if I was in there and I was minded to think about what we could do to change this. I think you just have to think about those connection points between most people's lives and politics. So how would politicians meaningfully connect with people in the places that they are in, i.e. workplaces? And if politicians aren't really willing to, re-embrace trade unionism, I think you'd have to start thinking, a bit more kind of laterally about this potentially. There are practical things that people have suggested. So, for example, there has been grant funding for working class candidates in the Labour Party. Some people have talked about the idea of a working class only shortlist in the same way that there are all women shortlists. But the issue you come around to there is, well, who's going to decide how working class somebody is? Is it accent? Is it what their grandparents did, what their parents did? It's very common now to hear politicians framing themselves as working class when actually, when one delves into it, it's fairly clear that they had a sort of more standard middle class upbringing, for example. I also think the public imagination hasn't caught up with the fact that the working class no longer are going to look like the sort of steptoe and son style kind of imaginary that maybe dominated for so much of the 20th century. So I think it's a tricky problem to address in answer to your question.
And does that come back, Peter, to your development of your earlier thinking about the robustness of institutions and the need to think institutionally about all of this? Is this where that becomes significant? Because I suppose part of the argument is that we have a sort of an architecture of politics in which there is a self-perpetuating group of people and a self-perpetuating way of thinking that has considerable advantage.
Yeah, I think we have a dominant sense of who would be a good politician and who wouldn't. And that's sort of difficult to shift, despite all of the evidence that the people we thought would be really good have turned out to be not quite so good after all. So, if you look at the CVs of people like Keir Starmer and Liz Truss and David Cameron and George Osborne and, all the rest of the people who sort of were steeped in that kind of Westminster's idea of what a good politician might be, and I'd also kind of involve the news media in this as well. And they have essentially sort of, kind of shut down the conversation as to what a good politician might actually be outside of some of these ideas. Arguably the only serious sort of alternative model of politics that's had any purchase in Britain in recent times is the Labour leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. Now, that had many faults that you could go into, but it did present a sort of alternative way of thinking about how you might run a political party and what a good political leader might look like. Now, it wasn't successful in the end, and partly that you could lay the blame for that at Corbyn and his acolytes' door. But I think partly it was also just an unwillingness on the part of the sort of broader British public sphere to kind of consider the possibility that you could do politics in a slightly different way, or that you could be an effective political leader without having the kind of credentials that these other people had.
Right. What is the evidence, if there is evidence, for saying that what we traditionally refer to as working class people prefer political representatives who share their characteristics, their background, their experience, like Angela Rayner, for example, rather than those who come from privileged backgrounds like Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson, for instance? I mean, might it be that part of being within working class culture is an admiration for people who are not working class?
So in terms of the evidence for this, it's very tricky to measure something like this. In terms of the individual level, does an individual person sort of prefer someone from their own background? There are a bunch of different ways you can go around it. You could survey people and sort of experiment at the individual level and with the characteristics of candidates that you present to them and then ask them which they prefer. The problem with that is that it's fictional candidates. So while we might think that the relationships seem to be strong, i.e. there is evidence that people basically prefer people with backgrounds like themselves, we could argue that in the real world, those relationships might not stand up. essentially. So those relationships might only hold in the sort of fictional universe of the survey experiment. Having said that, there is evidence, I'm thinking of work by Oliver Heath at Royal Holloway, University of London, and he's looked at this using real world ballot data. And he found that Labour voters are more likely to turn out and vote for the Labour candidate when that candidate has a working class background. So there is some evidence for it, despite the difficulties with measuring it. In terms of admiration and things like that, I think, again, it's just very difficult to tease out the kind of effect of what I was talking about earlier, which is that if your news media are sort of hammering home the idea that these people who aren't like you are the greatest thing ever and are going to, offer deliverance via the ballot box, etc., I think it's very hard to kind of overcome that overwhelm of information, whether it's right or wrong.
What is it, do you think, about the speech styles, the rhetorical style of the contemporary political class that somehow fails the good representative test? I refer specifically to speaking because that is perhaps the most direct and shared experience we have of the political class. And that's the one that either gets ridiculed or admired. And I wonder whether you think that there is something going on there that somehow fails to meet a representative standard.
I mean, I'm sort of riffing here, but my sense of it is that politicians are dealing with an increasingly complicated set of circumstances. So the nature of global problems now is such that they are what, management consultants would call wicked problems. There's no sort of good solution to a lot of them. If you were going to seriously try and address them in the best interests of most advanced democracies, you'd end up upsetting a lot of voters who are alive right now and who aren't going to vote for you again if you were a politician. So instead, what politicians tend to do, it seems to me, is hedge, or they tend to not make the kinds of big commitments that maybe some voters would like to hear. But in the end, all it ends up sounding is somewhat disingenuous. So, for example, when you hear Keir Starmer talking about stopping the boats and these things, I think people can just tell that the guy doesn't really believe that this is going to stop these things happening. So these deals that they're coming up with are actually going to stop it. And they're unwilling to deal with they're unwilling to front up to the public that actually, the boats crisis is caused by, first of all, if you want to see it as a crisis, but at least if you assume that it is a crisis, the boats crisis is actually caused by, a series of interrelated international issues that are being intensified by climate change, which Britain alone can't deal with. He's not going to say that because it would arguably be electoral suicide. We don't live in the West Wing where, you can sort of put forward your kind of rational speech to the public and have them praise you after. So I think there's something in that. I think it's also coming back to the book that I wrote. I think that there's something about the fact that people don't like the way that a lot of professional politicians speak, because it's a type of speech that's sort of largely produced within institutions where it's also consumed, if that makes sense. So someone like Keir Starmer or Ed Miliband or indeed David Miliband, his brother, who's no longer on the political scene. But, if you listen to the way that these people tend to speak, it's speech that's for the consumption of actually a relatively small group of people who will then transmit the kind of thrust of that message to the wider public. So it's speech that's aimed at the media, it's speech that's aimed at their fellow MPs. And actually, it then has this sort of slightly inside baseball-esque quality to it, like these strange turns of phrase and unusual intonations and things like that actually no one speaks like. So, if you go out into the world, you don't hear people saying it is right that X or whatever. So I think there's something to that as well, that sort of distance between the public and politicians that has affected the way they speak, and that means it just doesn't ring true for most people.
I thought that's a great answer. You should riff more often, Peter. So I want to ask you about the looming battle between Labour and Reform. Next general election I know people say it before every general election, but I can't think of a more meaningful time to say it than before the one that is coming. It's going to be a monumental choice. What does Labour, as the current government, need to do to counter Reform's claim to be representing some deeper, perhaps some more psychically core essence of the people?
I think that the way that Labour can combat what Reform are doing is by not trying to win that representative battle in the short term. I think in many ways it's simpler to create the country that will vote for you than it is to try and conjure it, if that makes sense. So I think if Labour focused on delivering economic growth, if they focused on solving some of the more obvious issues in the British public realm, I think doing that would bring into being the country that is likely to vote Labour. I don't think you can just conjure it out of thin air.
Isn't that what they told Joe Biden, though? Okay, you're up against this masterful and cunning communicator, Trump, but deliver, do things within the economy that really matter to people, and you'll win. He didn't.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, I would also say that I think Biden was a catastrophically bad candidate. Having said that, you could make a case that Starmer's not exactly a great candidate. Right. I think this is, I mean, I'm not suggesting this would necessarily work, but this is certainly what I would advise they do. I think the problem if you get into a sort of rhetorical arms race with Farage and Reform is that you're never going to win because they don't necessarily believe they will have to deliver on this. Whereas if you are the government, there are a bunch of things that you can do to change a country now in material terms. But for reasons that, you know, some I am sympathetic to, others less so, I think Labour have just been unwilling to pull the trigger on doing those things.
Let me ask you a final question, again about representativeness, which you've written about so well. I wonder whether there might be another kind of unrepresentativeness, I think you've alluded to it anyway, within the political class, which we're perhaps a little bit too polite to speak about. So how shall I put it delicately? Well, I know I won't put it delicately. Could it be that the political class simply attracts weird and nerdy and not commonly likable people, and that the diversity that we really need is to simply have more people who you would want to go and have a pint with? And so although there's a lot of criticism about those kind of seemingly superficial surveys about would you prefer to have a pint with A or B, perhaps there is something in that, in the sense that people don't particularly want to be friends with politicians, but they don't want, as politicians and representatives, people with whom they could never imagine possibly having any kind of relationship.
Well, there's a few ways to tackle that question. So the first one is I agree that politics does tend to attract weirdos, but that's partly because the selection system that we've sort of put in place to filter the overall population into the 650 odd people who run the country selects for people who are highly unusual in terms of how they A, like to spend their time, and B, how willing they are to give up what most of us would think of as things that you wouldn't want to give up. So, for example, the right to, you know, maybe have one drink too many and make a bit of a prat of yourself or whatever. These are things that essentially you're giving up from a very young age if you ever want to be a politician now, because you just don't know that video or that TikTok or whatever is one day going to come out and do you in later down the line. So, Oscar Wilde said, problem with socialism, it takes up too many evenings. But I mean, arguably the problem with becoming a politician is it takes up too much from you, full stop. If you're going to be, again, let's say for the sake of argument, if you're going to become a Labour MP, you know, you're looking at giving up your weekends to campaigning, your evenings going to CLP meetings. You'd have to get in with the trade unions. You'd have to do something like that. Chances are you could only work in certain kinds of jobs, or you'd need to work in and around Westminster, which immediately affects where you're going to live, the kinds of people that you're going to be spending time with. And realistically, it probably means that in terms of potential romantic partners, you want someone who's fully on board with your political project. So it's a big sacrifice to get there, and but that's before you add into the equation the potential obstacles faced, for example, particularly by women or people from ethnic minorities, or indeed anybody who had children. So there's a huge barrier there, I think, to getting, like you say, a full diversity of people into political life. In terms of the sort of going for a pint test, I mean, Will Jennings and Nick Clark and other colleagues at the University of Southampton, Jonathan Moss and Jerry Stoker as well, have written excellently about this in their book, The Good Politician. And they sort of make the point that while people have always wanted contradictory things from politicians, so they want them to be their mate, but they also want them to press a nuclear weapons button that would incinerate them and their entire family, which is, an unusual combination of characteristics to want in somebody. That has intensified in recent times because we just know so much more about politicians now than we ever did. We can surveil them, essentially 24/7. If someone disappears for a few days, like we saw with Donald Trump recently, it's really strange. Whereas I think in the immediate post-war period and earlier, it wouldn't have been that odd to not necessarily see the prime minister, or perhaps even particularly know how what he looked like necessarily. But there's sort of a flip side to that, which is back then it feels to me that it was more likely that you would see a politician in the flesh in your community. Whereas now that feels really quite stage managed, and partly for good reason. The security concerns of MPs mean that spontaneity has really been taken out of what they do now. So I was chatting to one MP earlier this year who told me that whenever they want to do an event in their constituency, they have to keep the location secret, the time secret, and then bit by bit, these bits of information are sort of dripped out to people who've agreed to sign up and hand over identifying details and all the rest of it. So I think simultaneously there's this sort of sense that we're overloaded with information about these people, but then equally have no in the flesh access to them. And I think if anything, it just tells us that in the flesh spontaneous access was maybe more important than we ever gave it credit for.
Yeah. Peter, I've really enjoyed listening to what you've had to say, and I really hope that in whatever form it takes, you continue to enlighten us about the nature of the political class, the challenges of the political class, and more importantly, I guess, the challenges of the politically represented. So thank you very much for taking part today.
Thank you, Stephen.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.